Welcome back. Today we're wrapping up the epic story of the Punic Wars with one of the most brutal acts in all of ancient history, the complete and total annihilation of Carthage by its rival, Rome.
So let's just start with the phrase that pretty much sealed a city's fate. This wasn't just some political talking point, it was an absolute obsession. A Roman senator named Cato the Elder ended every single speech with these words, no matter the topic. It became this drumbeat, this constant call for total destruction.
But how on earth did it get to this point? I mean, to really understand the end, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to look at the 50 years of so-called peace that happened right after Rome defeated the great general Hannibal. Now here's what's so interesting. For half a century, Carthage basically did everything right. They played by the rules, they paid off this absolutely crippling war debt to Rome, they focused on trade, and they rebuilt their economy. But, and this is the key, instead of making Rome feel secure, all this success did the exact opposite. It made them nervous. It just goes to show you, sometimes a rival's peaceful comeback can feel even more threatening than their open aggression. And this slide just lays it all out, right? You have two completely different mindsets. Carthage sees its new wealth as, peaceful prosperity. We're just rebuilding. But Rome, which now had this unrivaled military, was just gripped by paranoia. They didn't look across the Mediterranean and see a trading partner. No, they saw the ghost of an enemy they thought they had killed, and they were terrified it was coming back to life.
Yeah, this fear, it wasn't just bubbling under the surface. It was actively, deliberately stoked and used as a weapon by some really powerful people in Rome to get an outcome they had already decided on.
And at the very center of it all was Cato the Elder. I mean, it is hard to overstate his obsession. It didn't matter if he was giving a speech about aqueducts or farming or taxes, he would finish every single time with that same chilling line, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed.
So what you've got to understand is this wasn't really about a real imminent threat. Carthage wasn't about to attack. This was about old wounds, the trauma of Hannibal's invasion, and a deep, ruthless ambition for the future. It's just a terrifying example of how a nation's anxiety can be twisted to justify a preemptive strike. Rome basically decided that its own destiny could only be secure if Carthage was just wiped off the map for good.
So with the politicians all fired up, Rome didn't just sit around and wait for an excuse to attack. Oh no, it carefully built one. They used diplomacy not to keep the peace, but as a weapon to force a war they had already decided they were going to fight.
Just look at these demands. Carthage was so desperate for peace, they actually agreed to the first two. They handed over their own children as hostages, and then they gave up their entire arsenal, every sword, every shield, every catapult. And then, once Carthage was completely defenseless, Rome dropped the bombshell, the third demand. This wasn't a condition for peace, it was a death sentence.
I mean, think about it. For a city built on sea trade, moving 10 miles inland meant the end of everything. Their economy, their culture, their whole identity was tied to the sea. Rome had given them a choice: die a slow death as farmers in a new, barren land, or die fighting for the home they loved. They chose to fight.
Rome honestly expected this to be a quick mop-up job, an easy win against a city with no weapons. What they got instead was a brutal, horrifying 3-year siege against a people who had absolutely nothing left to lose.
This part of the story is it's unbelievable. After giving up all their weapons, the people of Carthage turned their entire city into a giant weapons factory. They melted down statues to make swords. The women famously cut off their own long hair to braid into ropes for the catapults. It was a total, all-in, desperate mobilization.
And this really puts the human tragedy into perspective. We're talking about 500,000 people, the population of a massive, vibrant, cultured city, one of the biggest in the ancient world, all of them now trapped inside their walls, fighting not for victory, but just for the right to exist.
So when the Romans finally broke through the walls in 146 BC, the end wasn't some glorious, swift battle. It was a slow, agonizing slaughter. For 6 straight days, Roman soldiers fought block by block, house by house. It was so bloody that it took another 10 days after that just to clear the streets of the rubble and the bodies.
But what happened next, after the fighting stopped, is what cemented the fall of Carthage in the history books as the ultimate example of total war, where winning means absolute, complete annihilation.
The numbers here are just staggering.
Of that 500,000 people, it's estimated that 450,000 were killed. The roughly 50,000 who managed to survive the siege, they were rounded up and every single one of them was sold into slavery. An entire civilization just erased.
Now this brings us to one of the most famous stories from the ancient world. You've probably heard it, that the Romans then plowed the city into the ground and sowed the fields with salt so that nothing could ever grow there again. But is that what actually happened?
Well, the reality is that story is a myth. It's a great story, but it probably didn't happen. No ancient writers mention it, and besides, salt was way too valuable back then to waste on that scale. But here's the really disturbing part. They didn't need to salt the earth. The real story, the complete physical destruction of the city brick by brick and the enslavement of its entire population, was a much more powerful and effective statement. The myth isn't even as bad as the reality.
And this act of utter destruction gave us a term for this kind of victory. It's called a Punic peace. It's when the winner doesn't just defeat the loser, they obliterate them, making it impossible for them to ever be a threat again. And it's a concept that, frankly, still haunts us today. A warning from history about what happens when peace terms are designed not for reconciliation, but for annihilation.
So, here's the takeaway. The fall of Carthage wasn't just the end of an old rivalry. It was the moment Rome became the one and only superpower in the Mediterranean. Wiping out their only real competitor created this massive power vacuum that Rome was more than happy to fill, and it set them firmly on the path from being a republic to becoming an empire.
The story of Carthage just leaves us with this really profound and heavy question. It's a dark reminder of what can happen when fear and ambition are allowed to run wild, and it forces us to ask, what is the true cost of completely eliminating an enemy, not just for the ones who are destroyed, but for the soul of the victor who does the destroying?